Greetings of the day to my audience. My name is Pronay Mondal, and the topic I would be presenting on today is loss aversion and the endowment effect. So, let's begin the presentation with the bibliography, that is, the reading that was required to do this particular presentation. Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, Chapter 26, Prospect Theory, Loss Aversion. Misbehaving by Richard Thaler, Chapter 4, Value Theory. Nudge by Richard Thaler and Cass Sustain, Chapter 1, Biases and Blunders, Gains and Losses. So let's begin with the prospect theory. So, the prospect theory is basically the theoretical contribution to behavioral economics. This particular idea was taken from prospect theory and analysis of decision under risk by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. Econometrica, volume 47, number 2. One of the key components of this prospect theory. So, this prospect theory has a key component called loss aversion. So, let's move on to the next slide. This slide particularly is an example of a very graphic example of the theory I just mentioned. People are more motivated to avoid a loss than to acquire a similar gain, because people always want to reduce their loss, even if it means possibly avoiding the chances of acquiring gain. So, gains and losses are relative to a reference point. In The Undoing Project by Michael Lewis, Daniel Kahneman is described as imagining the following scenario. Yesterday, Jack had $1 million and Jill had 9 million. Today, Jack and Jill each have 5 million. Assuming they are otherwise identical, are they equally happy? Standard economics would say they are equally happy, but Kahneman concluded that Jill was obviously less happy than Jack. Why? Because she had $9 million and that got reduced to $5 million. However, Jack had $1 million and that got increased to $5 million. It's not quite the same. Gains and losses again. In The Undoing Project, we observe this. What matters is whether an outcome is a gain or a loss relative to each person's reference point, or in this case, the status quo. So, the reference point is basically what a person owns. If equalizing means reducing what they have, then they would be less happy, obviously. And if it means an increment of whatever they own, then they would be happier. Loss aversion measured. Loss aversion measured. This is the next topic that we are going to discuss. So, for more reference and a more detailed explanation, you might want to visit this link that has been mentioned here in this particular slide. It's basically Daniel Kahneman speaking on loss aversion, explaining that concept. Experiment after experiment has shown that people will accept a gamble with equal odds of a loss and a gain as long as the gain is roughly 2.5 times the loss. So this is a statistical deduction, which means that 2.5 times the loss, people are willing to gamble. 2.5 times the loss, when the gain is 2.5 times the loss, that's when people are willing to gamble. They're willing to take the risk. Gains, losses, and the reference outcome. Human beings are unique in nature. Every human being is different from the next one. So people always, it's a known fact, people react differently to gains and losses, just how people react differently to different stimuli. They have different responses to different stimuli. So people react differently to gains and losses. It is important to people whether an outcome is a gain or loss, definitely. Because when a person is investing in a business, he's obviously doing it to get a gain so that he can continue the business and turn it into a livelihood. That's what an investment is all about. But that's why it's always important to the investor whether the outcome is a gain or a loss. This means that people classify each outcome as a gain or a loss. So an outcome is kind of a binary concept for people. It's either a gain or a loss. And if it's a gain, that means the investment was successful. This means that people compare each outcome to a reference outcome or status quo or default. So, just like we explored in the previous slide, the reference point defines whether the outcome made the person happy or sad. So, hence, the reference outcome, that is the outcome based on the reference or the status quo of the person, is what people compare other outcomes with. If an outcome is better, then the reference outcome is a gain. Otherwise, it's a loss. So, standing at the reference point, a person needs to know, my apologies, a person needs to know whether the outcome is a gain or it is a loss. Now, let's move on to the next slide. Gains, losses, and reference outcome again. We just saw that people react very differently to gains and losses. Whether an outcome is perceived as a gain or a loss depends on how the outcome compares to a reference outcome, which means basically that the reference outcome is what the previous profit was about. Now, according to that reference point, if the person makes more profit, that's when it's perceived as a gain. Otherwise, it's a loss. But this also means that whether an outcome is perceived as a gain or a loss depends also on what outcome is considered to be the reference outcome. People need to know that which particular outcome should they refer to as the reference outcome. They should set the bar so that they know whether they should go above it or below it. If they go below it, then definitely it's a loss. Otherwise, it's a gain. This opens the door to this concept called framing, the word that is mentioned in italics. Depending on how the reference outcome is framed, the same outcome could be seen as a gain or a loss. If an outcome is framed as a loss, then obviously that won't be the reference point. If it's framed as a gain, then that would be the reference for future investments. Loss aversion and framing. If the same choice is framed as a loss rather than a gain, different decisions will be made, of course, because all the decisions depend on whether the reference was a gain or a loss. Loss aversion or framing. Imagine that let's use an example to explain this concept better. Imagine that the US is preparing for the outbreak of an unusual disease which is expected to kill 600 people. Choose a program, either A or B, to address the problem. 200 people will be saved, 1/3 chance that 600 people will be saved, 2/3 chance that no people will be saved. So which one should we pick as a reference point depends on us, how we look at the problem, and depending on that, the decisions will be made. And obviously, in either of the case, the decision would be unique, which means the decisions would be different compared if we compare situation A and situation B. Let's go to the 13th slide. Imagine that the US is preparing, like I said, this is a very graphic representation of the problem I was posing. So, 22% chance 400 people will die, 78% chance, 1/3 chance that nobody will die, 2/3 chance that 600 people will die. Only the framing changed. 600 people expected to die, 1/3 chance that no one will die, 2/3 chance that 600 people will die. 600 people expected to die, 1/3 chance 600 people will be saved, 2/3 chance that no people will be saved. But this might look equal, but if we look at the statistics, then 78% would be the death rate here and 28% would be the death rate here, and they are obviously unequal. We will take that the great risks to avoid a loss. Reframing the same option as a loss changes the choice. This experiment is discussed further in chapter 34, Frames and Reality of Thinking, Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. He says that the puzzle presented by this experiment has become known as the Asian disease problem. Now, in the stock market, when an investor sells a losing stock, she is committing to the loss. Basically, she's committed to the loss that she's incurring when she's selling a stock and actually incurring losses. Does loss aversion cause investors to hold losing stocks longer than winning stocks? The predictable irrationality discussed here is known as the disposition effect. It is discussed in chapter 32, Keeping Score, of Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman in the section titled Mental Accounts. Now, let's observe this particular study. The study was held between 1987 to 1993, tracking 10,000 brokerage accounts from that particular time period, including 162,948 trades. That's 1,62,948 trades in one year. In any one year, what share of losing stocks were sold? What share of gaining stocks were sold? Note the strong opposing tax incentives. It's 9.8% when share of when we are trying to calculate what share of losing stocks were sold, and 14.8% in the second option. Would investors have been better off to hold the winners and sell the losers? Average 252-day gain after winners sold. Average 252 gain after other stocks sold but losing stocks held. So this explains whatever we explained in the previous slides better from the point of view of a person who's looking at the problem from a very practical point of view. Would investors have been better off to hold the winners and sell the losers? 2 plus 2.35% better than the market. Average 252-day gain after other stocks sold but losing stocks held, 1.06% worse than the market. So this example makes whatever we discussed in the previous slides quite clear. Now let's talk about sunk cost fallacy. Once you have made an unrecoverable payment for something, the amount you have paid is sunk. That means it's gone. Your future behavior should not be influenced by sunk costs, but typically they do, because we suffer from the sunk cost of fallacy. Researchers have found that the price at which owners listed condominiums in Boston was highly correlated with the buying price. Like an example can be put here that in posh areas, probably that same apartment would have cost more, and in a rundown neighborhood, it would cost less. So, owners are less willing to sell a stock whose price has fallen than a stock whose price has risen, even though the former makes more sense for tax reasons. Professional investors in real estate and stocks have been found to be less likely to make these errors because, of course, they're professionals with more experience. Loss aversion is everywhere. Loss aversion may explain various forms of predictable irrationality. When irrationality occurs and it's predictable, then loss aversion may explain why it happened. Endowment effect, disposition effect, the sunk cost fallacy, status quo bias, paradox of choice, and the diversification bias. So, that's all about loss aversion and the endowment effect by Pronay Mondal. That's me. Thank you very much. Winning isn't everything. Not being the reason you learn losses is everything. Thank you so much.